session towards planetary sustainability. This is our second in this series, and the focus of this session is on the power of embodiment for transformation of ourselves as leaders, teams, organizations, and systems. My name is Lisa Melvin. I work with the Green Commodities Program at UNDP. I've been doing that for 6 and a bit years now, and really focusing on multi-stakeholder collaboration and systems change as part of my work and strategy. And I've also, at the same time, been working with the Strozzi Institute and soaking, I would say, in Strozzi Somatics for just over 10 years now. I'm an embodied leadership coach, certified by the Strozzi Institute, and I'm also part of the teaching team with the Strozzi Institute. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce to you today Staci K. Haines, one of my greatest teachers. She's the director of methodology and a senior teacher at the Strozzi Institute. She also co-founded an organization called Generative Somatics, which brings somatics and embodiment work to social and environmental justice leaders. And she's also the recent author of a book called The Politics of Trauma, Somatics, Healing and Social Justice, something that the world very timely needs right now. And yeah, and also a dear friend and colleague. So welcome, Staci, to UNDP.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Good morning, everyone, or at least morning my time. We're stretching around the globe, I have the feeling. Happy to see you all. For those of you who are willing to take yourself or put yourselves on camera, that'd be awesome, because then I can look at you too. You have some nice backgrounds going on. Great. Hello, good morning. Awesome. So my guess is you're incredibly used to the Zoom world at this point. But we're gonna, as we go today, if you have questions that you want to throw into chat, feel free to throw them in there. There'll definitely be moments when we just open it up for Q&A, and I think both Alex and Lisa are going to help me manage that. But we'll be interactive in what we're doing. We have 2 hours together today. About the first 45 minutes is going to be a little bit more of me talking and then Q&A. And then because this is about what we call embodied transformation or embodiment work, the second part, we're going to be getting up and practicing. So no, it's going to be a bit more interactive as we go, and hopefully it'll make sense why by the time we get there. My name's Staci, as Lisa said, and I have been in this field of somatics for 25 years now. I have had a long time passion for how is it that human beings change, like how do we change? And then how do social systems change, and what does that have to do with each other? And I think that question, because it's such a big one, will probably keep me busy for the rest of my life. But why I stayed in somatics is I was very impressed with how deeply and how pragmatically somatics help people develop and change. And that's really at the level of leadership, at the level of team, and at the level of organization. So I'll be sharing stories as we go today. But you know, somatics really lets us take great ideas kind of off the page or off the PowerPoint and into action, into how we relate, particularly when we're under pressure, because there's very predictable things that happen in us under pressure, which we'll get into. But it has definitely held my interest for, well, going on 3 decades now. So I'm happy to get to share it with you. Let's all do that thing of put in the chat where you are located at the minute, at the moment, and also how are you doing entering our call this morning? Nice for me to get a sense of where you all are seated. Hello, Quito, Ecuador. I lived in Cuenca for a while. New York, Peru, awesome, great. Thank you for doing that. All right, I'm just gonna dive in. I'm gonna share my screen here and get us going. All right, my screen shared with everybody. We good, Lise?
Yeah, it's good.
Great. Okay, cool. So we're going to talk about embodiment and what is that and what does it mean, as Lise said, for leaders, for teams, for communities, and for systems. So that's where we're diving in today. And just a second, let me get all my commands in the places I want them to be. Sorry, I'm arranging you all in my slides. There we go. So in kind of the social change world and the leadership development world, at least in the US, this word transformation is getting thrown around a lot these days. And I just wanted to give you our definition of that. So we know we have transformed when our actions align with our vision and values, even under the same old pressures. And this is the key part inside of somatics, is we really are looking at what's trained into our nervous systems, what habits are established in our neurobiology, and are those strong enough to keep our practices or our actions or how we relate aligned with what we most care about, particularly under pressure, because it's under pressure that things tend to go pretty wild, which I'm sure is not news to you all, given the work that you do. And then somatics. What is this thing called somatics? First of all, just so you know, the term was coined in 1972 by someone named Thomas Hanna. And it basically has a Greek root. It means the living body or the living organism in its wholeness. And in English, we just don't have a word that describes, we have mind, we have body, we've inherited a fairly objectified view of the body, like it's a thing that kind of takes us around to our next meeting or that we keep in shape. But we don't have a good word in English that kind of means this is a live organic process, which is really what somatics means. You know, most people think we're saying semantics, which is something else altogether, but somatics is what we're working with, or what we have been for these 50 years. But basically it is what you see here. It's a holistic methodology. It really looks at embodied change. We work through the mind body, which I'll talk about, you know, what that is, or sometimes we say we work through the soma, but mind body tends to be a little bit more accessible. To really change conscious and unconscious patterning and shift from reaction to choice. Yeah. So that's really what we're going to dive into. And again, we do that with larger and larger groups of people through these core pieces here, building somatic awareness. And that is really fundamentally learning to listen to the information that appears through the sensations. We'll practice some of what that is, but there's a lot of information that comes through the sensation long before it shows up in a thought. So often the quickest way for us to find what's happening inside of us, especially as we're moving into reactivity, or how to listen deeply, is we need to also listen through the body or with the body and sensation. Really think about that as a foundational language. Sensation is a foundational language. This work includes somatic practice, and we'll kind of look at what practices have we inherited, what practices are default practices, and then how do we line up our purposeful practices with really our vision and values. Somatic opening. The easiest way to say that is we have deeply established patterns that we've learned through practice over time. Some of these we could think of as our survival strategies that we really engaged in high stress or traumatic situations. And those patterns root very deeply in the neurobiology and the psychobiology. And as we're changing in a holistic way, we get to uproot some of those patterns while we're placing new practices in, kind of so those new practices root more deeply. And then we bring to the work an analysis of social conditions, because we also, in our lingo, embody our social conditions, even when we don't mean to, or even when we don't agree with them. So we'll dig into that some today. And like I said, somatics can be used at different scales. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience behind somatics for a couple of slides, and then we'll pause for some Q&A. Folks may have heard of Bessel van der Kolk. He's doing a lot of writing and a lot of work around somatics. What we'll see is much of the study around how we change and the psychobiology is done based on trauma. It's just really where the research monies have gone and really where there's the most suffering. But we can look at all of this just through the lens of stress, not necessarily through the lens of a stress as high as trauma, but it's relevant across the board. But Bessel van der Kolk is a neuropsychiatrist. His book is very well known right now. This is his latest book. So basically in neuroscience, what we see, and I can talk a little bit about the construct and why this works, but that we change by being able to feel our inner experience and work with, or what he says, befriend what's happening inside of us. And that's a lot of these survival strategies or automatic reactions under pressure or threat that we'll talk about. And then I thought this second quote was important, and especially given the context in which many of you work. I know that you're exposed to traumatized populations, traumatized communities often. Sadly, that is everywhere. But this piece about feeling chronically unsafe and the past or traumatic experiences keep kicking off the same chemical reactions, triggering and deepening certain neuronal pathways. And basically what happens inside of a highly stressed soma or mind body, or one that's been traumatized or chronically traumatized, is new information does not come into that system because the system is always tracking for danger. So this is what what somatics understands very deeply, and then what we use some of these processes and practices to shift. Okay. Let me move on here. Candace Pert, she passed away in 2013, but she was a very important neuroscientist and pharmacologist. She and her partners really discovered how neuropeptides worked, which I don't need to unpack, and maybe some of you know. And really her work undergirds how very important medications, anti-anxiety and antidepressants work. So I think this is also a very, very important quote, that psychologists tend to treat the mind as a disembodied phenomena with little connection to the physical body. And then conversely, physicians do the opposite. Here's the body that must be disconnected from the psychological processes, but that they're really one system. And one thing that I appreciate that Candace Pert talked about is she really invited us to understand the human being as having three brains. So the brain that we think of, and it's the organ of the brain, where when we're not too stressed, executive functioning happens. When we're not too stressed, this brain and the hemispheres work as one whole. But then she really looked at the heart as the second brain, and all the way down to really the neurobiology and the communication systems, or how neuropeptides are communicating the emotional world really much more through the organ of the heart than the organ of the brain. So thinking, mind, feeling, mind. And then very interesting, she did a lot of study in her later years as basically what the thinking is that's happening, or what the neuronal functioning is that's happening in the large intestine. So the instinctual brain, gut feelings, should have trusted my gut, right? It's in our language and English, some still, but the instinctual brain or the intuitive brain even happening much lower in the body. And what we're doing in somatics was we're going, how do we listen to all three of these brains and then have them not be at cross purposes? Because when our thinking and our hearts or our instinct and our thinking are going in separate directions, one, it tends to cause a lot of duress, and also we don't make as good of decisions. So lining them up is part of what we're doing inside of somatics. The second quote is also very important when we start to talk about these embodied patterns that we learn, is that the way that we're wired, and it's really the brain, the nervous system, and even muscle memory, is we perceive what we see as possible. And we look to keep matching the patterns that are deeply embodied and, you know, that are kind of the most traveled neuronal pathways, which challenges change, right? If we're about change, but what we look for is what we already perceive or what keeps validating our reality, it makes change a bit complicated. All right, I have one more here, and some of you might have heard of Pumla Gaboro-Madikizela. She continues to do a lot of great work in South Africa and is known internationally as well. One of her most famous books is here. If you haven't read it, I really suggest it. It's a very potent book about the truth and reconciliation process, but really her very personal relationship with de Kock. So she looks at what happens with, of course, forgiveness is a very big part of her work, forgiveness and accountability. But she also really looked at what happened in communities during apartheid, post-political assassinations. So when the state would come in and assassinate political actors. And what she found is that in communities where after political assassinations, when the community would come together and dance, drum, and move together, and from a somatic point of view, basically reset the collective mind-body, like take the collective from a hyper-alert, more traumatized state to a more calm, cohesive state, that the amount of intra-community violence after those assassinations decreased. What she found in communities where people isolated, people mostly, you know, spent time alone, did not come together or did not grapple with what had just happened collectively, that the intra-community violence then increased. So she just has some very interesting work around the mind-body and then how she ties it to a more collective level, of course, of accountability and also her definition of forgiveness. Okay. Good. I'm going to pause here for a moment and ask you all. You can put it in the chat or just take yourself off mute and ask a question. But what questions or comments do you have at this point? Anybody? Hi, Simon. Yeah.
I was just thinking, particularly with your last example there, does this vary culturally across the world, the tendency to make these connections?
What varies culturally across the world is, of course, a practice. What cultural practice, of course, language has a lot of shaping of reality for us, depending on what language or what languages we speak. What isn't different, which I find so fascinating, is our responses to pressure and the survival strategies or states that we go into under pressure are a shared neurobiology across culture. Some might get more highlighted or more repressed because of cultural and social norms. but not the reactions themselves. We did a program in Ramallah, in the West Bank in 2005. We went over and worked with the Palestinian Counseling Center. And it was really one of the tests for me of somatics. Like, how much does this work and how much is this just like a West Coast California phenomena, right? And everything was simultaneously interpreted into Arabic. And given the context and culture with practices, we often do partner practices, and those really got split along gender lines. And what was stunning to me is when we really got into trauma, fight, flight, freeze, appease, dissociate, which we'll talk about in a minute, which are very automatic responses to high levels of pressure. The consistency with which people related to that, had stories to tell about it, really talked about which ones they weren't supposed to do, the impact of sustained curfew. It was stunning to me how much of that part, the neurobiology piece, translated immediately, as well as the practices, as well as some of the somatic opening work. So it was one of the markers for me when I went, yes, culture is different and the neurobiology shows up any place we are. Yeah. Anything else you want to add to that, Simon?
No, that's very clear. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Question, comment?
There was a question in the chat. Simone, if you want to come off mute and share your question, that would be great.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
I've been thinking about UNDP. I mean, all these meetings we've been doing about thinking of it as an organism. And the question I have is, how do we actually go and transform it into a collective rather than a combination of individuals, but rather a collective that would grieve and celebrate and process stress together? Because I think that's key to actually changing the organization rather than looking at our individual selves as having all the answers.
Well, that is a great question. I think it'll, as we go, the answers will keep unfolding, but I want to tell you a couple of stories. So, of course, as you all know, shared distinctions, right, give us a way to kind of understand pressure, stress, and collective pressure together. So some of the distinctions we'll be sharing today could become shared distinctions for you all. When we work, and as we work with organizations who have big systemic purposes like you all do, one of the things we do is get those organizations into shared practice, and it's shared practice with a purpose at the core. So some of those shared practices, which we're going to actually try on today, some of those shared practices is how do we understand and cultivate resilience within the whole group. So there are many resilience factors. We'll have our own particular ones, but there are practices that we can build into staff meetings, right? Into how communication happens, into what we give ourselves time to do that help build a collective sense of resilience, which tend to have what we call the collective body, which is a weird way of talking about it, but have the broader team be more flexible, less rigid, more change ready, less of a tendency to compartmentalize or polarize. So practices together is what we bring a lot of groups into. And then you all know systems change. Systems change is supported by many things. It's by narrative, by what practices we're in, by what we do together under pressure and what processes we have for pressure and conflict. And then of course, the structures or policies that we build to support the practices we want to be in. So, you know, again, because you all are systems people, the overarching purpose and narrative we live in and the policies we live in tend to drive us towards certain practices. And often they don't drive us toward the practices that we actually need to be aligned with our purpose and our mission. So let me give you an example. There's a social movement organization called the Asian Pacific Environmental Network. They are a statewide California-based and also national organization. They do the combination of immigrant rights, housing rights, environmental and environmental justice work. We have a very big refinery here in the Bay Area. They've done a lot of work around that. And what they were finding is their departments and teams kind of kept polarizing and almost competing with each other rather than working in tandem, right? So they had kind of their base building and organizing, they had their state and national policy teams. And this odd competition was emerging when actually these strategies and tactics should be co-aligned. And what we found is the policies and the team structure and how often the teams met, but the whole didn't, how they had structured things literally were helping the team build compartmentalization or practice compartmentalization, and in many ways supported competition instead of alignment. So part of what we did in our work with them is introduce what's the purpose that we're all here for. Now, people could say their mission, but they really needed a much clearer set of goals and objectives. Everyone shared the same 5 practices. So whether they're in their team meetings or whether they're in the full staff meeting or their coalition meetings, those 5 practices they brought in over and over again. So they became a baseline of what was shared. We interrupted a lot of the departmental meetings and created cross-departmental meetings. There are numerous things that we did, but shared practice and changing the structures is really what helps bring together some of what you're pointing to. Yeah. All right, I think given our time, I'm gonna go forward and hopefully keep answering that question as we go. And Lisa, anything else in the chat I should pay attention to at the moment?
There's a couple of comments, but I think we can come back to them when we have Q&A a bit later.
Okay, great. All right, so we're answering some of this already, but just kind of why is it important to understand this more holistic process of change as leaders? And it's this, really how we be, what choices we can make, and how we react is informed by what's embodied in us. And most of what's embodied in us is not conscious to us, okay? That our automatic reactions under pressure and our resilience are already embodied. So how do we leverage and nourish or cultivate resilience, and then actually work with and change the places where we automatically react and end up really not choosing based on vision or what we value. We can build more flexibility into leaders, teams, organizations. We just discussed that some. And then we can develop a wide range of options in how we work with and build trust with others. You know, one of the things that I appreciate so much about understanding embodied patterning or embodied habits is that we can recognize it in ourselves and we can also see it in another. And then we can adapt to be able to build trust with others. So let's just say people who, for multiple of personal and cultural reasons, might be more what we call contained or create more space or distance. It builds more body-to-body trust to respect and then give more distance, or in quotes, match the embodiment of another person. And that's not mimicking, but matching it communicates kind of nervous system to nervous system, a quality of respect. And I'm sure you all are very skilled in this just around distance, right? Like how close or how far apart we stand is so culturally informed, but has so much information comes through that. And so much distrust happens if we, in quotes, disrespect that, okay? All right, I'm going to dive into some of the basics here, and then we'll open it up again. Somatics and neuroscience really understands that we have these constitutive needs as humans, and that we have this evolutionary biology that is literally designed to meet these needs. So none of these will be news, but I find it helpful to distinguish. Safety, that we are organized to track for and to try to take care of safety of ourselves and also those that we identify with, right? In many ways, we can say who we consider maybe our tribe. Safety, belonging. This is very deeply wired in us that we are trying to be part of the herd. And we are pack animals, we are herd animals. We do not do well in isolation. You know, we can look at our various, you know, prison systems or, you know, means of torture. I hate to say that, but it's part of what humans do. And one of the worst punishments inside of that is isolation for long periods of time. It's terrible for us. So we are tracking for belonging. We're tracking for being part of the herd or loving and being loved. And then dignity or honor or worth, it gets talked about differently in different cultural contexts. But dignity, it's very important that we go, oh, I matter, or I can contribute to others in a way that matters. And then, of course, as you all know, we have material needs, food, you know, good food, clean water, housing, education, healthcare. Obviously, we need those to survive. And again, it's always great talking to people who do work like you do. But of course, the social and economic conditions increase or decrease access to resources, and also increase and decrease access to safety, belonging, and dignity. So it isn't just, of course, individual experiences that affect safety, belonging, and dignity. It is very much economies and the distribution of resources and the distribution of safety, belonging, and dignity that people are responding to being affected and shaped by. And then here is what happens automatically in our, again, neurobiology or our mind body when we are under threat or under stress and pressure. We did not have to learn these responses. They literally came with the package. They came with our organism that we do this. So I'm sure many of you have heard under stress, under pressure, fight, flight, freeze, appease, and dissociate are these automatic responses that we don't have to think about. In fact, they bypass much of the what's called the executive functioning in the brain because this stat, I love, it takes 300 times longer to include the whole brain than it does for the stress centers in the brain to react, pass information down the spine, and move us into action. And that's really what's happening with these reactions. We're not considering what we should do. We just assess, pick one, and then move. I often find it really useful to think about other animals in these responses. Like most animals have a flight response. They run, they swim, they fly away from danger. It's one of the first ones that we engage. In humans, we do the same thing, right? We flee, we get away, or the impulse is to do that, and then we can't do that, and then we tend to do something different instead, like freeze or appease. But that flight impulse, my guess is you can all relate to. Appease, you know, one of the easiest things to do, I think, is just think about what dogs do, right? That rolling over and showing their bellies. You know, what dogs are doing, they're doing multiple things, but really they're showing all their internal organs, which is basically, I'm not going to hurt you, don't hurt me. Because one bite to an internal organ can be fatal. What's interesting with appease in human beings is what we do is very similar to a dog. An appease response, and some of you might relate to this, is we tend to shrink. We tend to get into more apologetic, like I'm not going to take up as much space. You know, I'm not a threat, right? Those kind of pieces. And then often also we'll tilt our head to the side, right? We'll tilt our head, shrink up, and then become very agreeable. No, whatever you want, it's fine, right? What's interesting is in this move, we're also doing what the dog does, is we're actually showing our jugular vein, yeah? So we have our own our own human way of appeasing, but the parallels to other mammals are very strong. Dissociate, people may not be familiar with, but it's basically leaving when we can't leave, checking out, floating away someplace else while our bodies stay in place. This is a very, very well-documented response. Part of what we look at with dissociation is how do we help people come back from checking out? How do we practice staying present for longer periods of time? And then freeze response, I'll talk about last. Possums are one of my favorite freeze animals, although many mammals freeze. Freezing is basically becoming very, very, very still, and in some ways waiting until the threat is over, right? Because the mind-body perception is it's the best way to survive is just to get very still. It also, what's happening chemically in the body, it really helps us numb and not feel as much. So it's also a way to sustain stress, pressure, trauma. But with the possums, what's great is the possum actually goes into a chemical coma state for 45 minutes to 4 hours. Their eyes will roll back in their head, they'll foam at the mouth, and then they also excrete a smell as if they've been dead for a couple of days. So the coyote, the dog comes up, there's a limp animal that stinks, and you know, the predator goes, oh, if I eat this, I'm also going to get sick, right? Anyway, it's a very, very well-developed freeze response in the possum. Sadly, not that good for cars, but good for coyotes and dogs. All right, I'm going to do this slide and then we'll pause again here. Other ways that we can think about our automatic reactions is that under pressure, we automatically move toward the situation, toward the conversation. This can go along with an appease response, but isn't always that. Toward, some of you might recognize yourself that you're coming into a new group of people, and an automatic move toward as you move in, you start introducing yourselves, you kind of notice what the dynamics are in the room and maybe move toward the person that looks like it's a hub in the situation. Those are all ways of moving toward. And I'm not saying that's not a fine choice, but when it's automatic, it's kind of the only thing that we can do to then establish a sense of safety, belonging, or dignity. Away from is really the opposite. That might be the person who comes into a new group and hangs out at the wall for a long period of time, maybe talks to one other person that's along the wall. Or when there's conflict, they're the ones that back up and are like, oh, I don't really want to deal with that. Where the person who moves toward might be the person who's like, we need to deal with the conflict. Let's all come together, yeah? And then moving against is just that when there's pressure, that there's a bump up against or a move up against pressure. And this might sound odd, but these are kind of the habits, or what we call the conditioned tendencies, that tend to build trust by fighting first, or tend to find alignment through struggling. Yeah, this can be difficult for people who move toward or who move away from as more of their patterned response. The move against is like, oh, why does that person always need to be contrary? Or why does that person always need to pick a fight or not agree, right? That's more of what a move against would be. Yeah. And then, when we were prepping, we were just playing around with, could we look at organizations? Those organizations will have patterns. With the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, their default under pressure was to move away from. That was not that useful, given what their work is. They especially moved away from conflict, which was also culturally informed. Yeah. But so we were playing around with an organization that is more of has a tendency to move against. You all can agree or not agree with us, or feel free to add your own examples in the chat. But with Greenpeace, yeah, that's really, we could count on a move against as an automatic reaction, but also as let's say, a prioritized strategy. World Wildlife Funds, we could think of as a move toward, like building relationship, getting into partnerships, building up more and more togetherness. Each of these has their own limitations, right? Strategically and also an effective impact. And then we could think of an individual preservationist. We could think of that as a move away from, because often people will go, well, here's what I'm gonna go do, and I'm gonna do it on my own. And when pressure in a coalition gets too high, I'm gonna not participate. So that kind of orientation of I'm gonna move away and maybe just do my own thing, okay? All right, let me tell one more story here, and then we'll pause again. National Domestic Workers Alliance is another organization that we've worked with. We co-designed their leadership development program for all of their members and ran that with them for about 7 years. Their members are domestic workers, so nannies, home health care workers, domestic workers, house cleaners. And we ran very extensive embodied leadership training programs or leadership development programs with them. 20 days, that would be 5 4-day intensives. The Alliance put a lot of commitment into their leadership development. We also did, organizer training inside of that, strategy training. We also were doing it in 4 languages and a multitude of cultures sharing the space. Primarily immigrant, 99% women. Many, of course, had migrated for economic reasons or for reasons of violence in their home countries. So what we found around what would happen with these members, with these leaders under pressure, is that in general, they would appease under pressure. And in general, they would try to smooth over conflict as fast as possible, neither of which really served their purpose and their purpose of being together, right? They're looking at national policy, state-based policy around domestic worker rights and winning basic labor rights in the United States, which domestic workers and farm field workers did not get included in labor rights in the 40s in the United States. So appeasing and smoothing over conflict obviously was not aligned with that, but was so aligned with their lived experience and often what they're asked to do in their work context, right? Appease, agree, perform, right? Don't stir up a lot of conflict because they might lose their job or they might then struggle or face any number of abuses in the workplace. So we really had to do a lot of work of validating and supporting those responses and where they came from as immigrant women, primarily poor, in the work context that they were in, and then how to really build more choice in them as a collective so that under pressure, they could stand up inside their dignity. Under pressure, they could hold a line. Under pressure or talking with, let's say, elected officials in DC, they could actually be in their power and not be appeasing. So that's much of the work and just a little bit of an example of, moving from, again, what we look at as automatic responses into building different and new practices that line up with the impact we're trying to have. So I'm going to pause here again, and we're going to take a brief micro break soon, but I just want to come back to questions, comments. You can add them to the chat, or again, you can take yourself off mute.
Yes, Staci, we had a question in the chat. Dolly, do you want to come off mute and share your question?
Thank you, Liz. Staci actually was more out of curiosity rather than anything, but and I think in your following slides you did mention culture quite a bit, and my question was how much does culture influence such automatic reactions, or also your general or collective approach to these things?
Obviously a lot. Culture is one of the main places that we learn certain practices. Our economic context, our social conditions, the social norms in which we either live, were raised. Yeah, a lot of them come from where we were raised and our mother tongue. But let me give an example. So with the National Domestic Workers Alliance program, there were peoples from Mexico, Central America, South America. There was a strong constituency from the Philippines, from the Caribbean. So when we really got to practices, like what practices resonated and made sense for people, I'll just give one example, is a number of the women from Mexico and Central America, we were talking about resilience, and folks went off to go, what's a resilience practice we can be in our organizations? So Mujeres Unidas y Activas is a very active member organization of NDWA. And really, they came back and they said, we decided salsa. Salsa is one of the most important resilience practices for us. Now, that's very culturally defined, but the principle of what they were practicing, of bringing more aliveness to them as a group and more connectivity, having practices that were body-based practices that helped release stress and increase resourcefulness or increase resilience, those principles are the same. Right underneath, once we understand kind of the neurobiology or the mind body. So the practices were different, but the stress responses are not different. They're shaped by context and culture. But at the baseline, that fight, flight, freeze, appease, dissociate, we all have all of those. And it can be highlighted by culture or repressed by culture, but not change. Those are just literally part of our neurobiology. So do you want to add anything to that?
No, that was a very clear explanation. Thank you, Staci.
Yeah, you're welcome. Mm-hmm. Other questions, comments? All right. My thought here, and Lisa, I'm going to kind of ask for your input. My thought is to actually do a breakout before we go on break, just so you all can actually get a chance to talk to each other a little bit. Lisa, do you have an opinion about that?
That sounds good. Sounds good. Right. Yeah.
There's been a lot of talking at.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm going to ask you all, we're going to put you into, it looks like we can do pairs. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask you to explore with your partner, basically what happens automatically to you under pressure. Now, I know we haven't done any practice yet, and sometimes what we think we do and actually what we do in the mind body is a little bit different. But, when you're under pressure, and for you, pressure might be a conflict. For you, pressure might be just like the overwhelm of the systemic international issues that we're trying to solve climate. Or pressure might be what's happening in your partnership or your marriage. And I'm not asking you to share any of that. You don't need to, but basically pick a pressure and go, under pressure, do you tend to move toward? Do you tend to move away from? Do you tend to move against? Yeah, toward, away from, or against. And, or you can really look at that fight, flight, freeze, appease, and dissociate and go, what of those do you relate to? Under pressure, what tends to kick in more automatically, not how you want to behave, but more automatically, okay? I'll tell a story about me, and this is a little bit about being trained by our broader social norms. So many people on this call might relate to this, but when I was younger, like teenager and young adults, it was very confusing to me when I was catcalled on the street, because I really didn't know how to react. It was like, is that supposed to be a compliment or what's going on? Just the sheer confusion of that. And also in walking down the street, what I noticed, and this is as I started to learn more about feminism, is when a man would be walking down the street and I'd be walking down the street, what I really learned to do is to cede the space to the man. And part of how I would do that is I would glance down, I would take up less space, I would look down, come out of the visual space, step to the side so that I came kind of off the line of walking and then let the man have that line. As I got exposed to feminism, I was like, I'm going to try not doing that. What is it like if I don't cede the space? And what's very interesting is as I started practicing something new, which is like, I'm going to keep my eyes up. I'm going to continue to also look at him without smiling or laughing, right? All those automatic appeased responses. And I'm just going to, right? Keep extending into this space and walking. And it was interesting. The first few times I did it, we literally almost ran into each other, because it was so not in them to cede the space. And I was practicing not ceding the space. And you know, you can watch this. I watch it moving down the streets when we used to walk on the streets more before COVID. Watching often how people who are given less systemic power, particularly around race in the United States, will cede the space to me. We'll be moving down the sidewalk and how quickly someone might step aside, or based on perceived class. Right? So that's a place you could look to. Where are you trained? Yeah. So toward, away from, or against, what tends to happen to you under pressure? Or what automatic responses, yeah, do you see inside of yourself using those two slides? So Alex or Lisa, will you send us into pairs? And we're going to take about 7 minutes. So once you get into your group, go ahead and split the time.
All right, so I'm setting up the rooms now. You'll get a pop-up that says join breakout room, and then you can just join your.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, just waiting for all colleagues to getting back. What is, in your opinion, the reaction of UNDP as an organization? Just an analogy of you were saying for WWF and Greenpeace.
Well, that's interesting. I'm going to ask you that question.
Because I wanted to see. I wanted to see from the outside, not from the inside. I wanted to see what is, in your opinion, the perceived reaction from UNDP, and maybe it's different from what we want to transmit to the outside world.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. I mean, the truth is, my response is I don't know you all well enough yet. So really, it's going to be an impression, and well, I'll just tell you my impression. The impression is. I wouldn't put in a toward, away from, or against, or I guess what I do is if I use that, a toward with a bit of an against underneath. What do you think of that?
Well, it's a good combination. I think the good question here to ourselves is what type of reaction or reactions we would like to have intentionally, rather than just well, a non-intentional reaction and just let things happen. So what exactly. I'm getting from here is a conscious of the reactions, and then that is the first step to define ourselves, how we want to react intentionally.
Exactly. Exactly. You know, in this methodology, we really start with that question, what you're posing, which is, what do you want? How do you want to be as a team? How do you want to be as an organization? Because we're always practicing towards something. It's very difficult to practice away from something we need to practice towards something and kind of get in the reps of purposeful practice. So just what you're saying is right on. How do we want to be? And then becoming aware of what do we do under pressure so that we can become more aware of it and also uproot it and pivot it. Yeah, we're going to dive into.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Anybody else, since we're just here, comments or questions from your conversation that you had?
Just a funny story. I've tried not giving space on the sidewalk in many different contexts, and
Yeah.
I've bumped into a lot of men.
Isn't it so interesting? It's like we really get handed these embodied practices collectively. And when you switch them up, yeah, thanks for sharing that. That's great.
It's actually, but I think it's also very cultural, because Norway was the place I bumped into less men.
Yeah, and also gender training is different in different cultural contexts. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Let me just ask you this. Did you recognize yourself, right, in your leadership, or did you recognize your team in some of these more automatic or reactive states?
May I speak?
Please, yeah.
So I was telling my partner that I recognized that I often appease, that I'm an appeaser, and he commented and said, you know, a lot of these, and which was a question that I actually had for you, which is, how did I learn to appease so often? How did I get into that pattern? If this is automatic, how did that automatic reaction how did I set into that path so that I so often appease? And he said that this is something that people learn in their childhood, right around before the age of 7, right? That we're kind of taught a lot of these patterns. I wanted, and I guess I wanted to ask you, how do we, so if I'm understanding it correctly, there's sort of the automatic stuff that we do as you know, reptiles, as you know, just animals in this earth, and the reptile part of us, or the part that's automatic. But then there's the stuff that we go into patterns into, right? That we repeat, and then it works for us, and then somehow it just kind of like sets itself in. But then is it about learning? Is it about just understanding what the reaction is? Because there's always going to be a reaction, and therefore we just need to watch that reaction. What is it that we need to learn? Is it just the watching, the recognizing of the experience, as opposed to the mindlessness around it? Is that where the learning comes? And then how do you teach children about this?
I like that. You just packed in 3 very big questions in one. That's great. We're about to look at a slide. In fact, I think I'm just going to share this again for a moment. Oh, hold on one second. Hold on, I have too many. Let me get you all to the side here. Okay, so your first question is, where do we learn this? We learn it at all of these different sites. Yeah, we call this sites of shaping, sites of change. You all, some of you might recognize it. It's actually a public health model that got used a lot around dealing with HIV and AIDS in the United States, about at what site do we need to instigate change. And it's multiple sites when we're looking at large social issues. But you know, where do we learn things? We learn things a lot from our family and our intimate network, right? We learn things from our communities. And then the institutions that we're inside of have us practice certain things and not practice other things. And then social norms and historical forces. So when you say, how did I learn this? We all learn through all of these sites, and obviously social norms and institutions, you know, the bigger the circle is, the more it's shaping the smaller circles inside of it. So while we might say, well, I really learned this from my experiences in my family or from my family culture or practices, that's always set inside of a broader context. So, you know, when I look at the appease response, and then I might ask you this question, and again, you can just share what you want to, but it's like, what was the benefit of appeasing inside of your family dynamics? And what was the benefit of appeasing inside your broader community or cultural dynamics? Because our adaptations that we take on were really useful and really strategic at a moment in time. And then they become habits as we practice them over time. Yeah. So a piece of research that was really done around high-end athletes about how does an embodied practice change, and this was around their performance. But what we really learned is it takes really 300 repetitions of a new practice for muscle memory. It takes 3,000 repetitions of a new practice for embodiment. And then, you know, when you think about the things we learned as a kid and that got reinforced, we might have 10,000 or 15,000 reps in that kind of muscle memory or that using that neuronal pathway. So your next question was really then how do we change? And we change in a couple of ways. We change through somatic awareness, which is becoming more aware about how those patterns actually live and operate in us. We change through taking on new practices and repetition of new practices. So first we'd want to go, well, what is that shaping of appease? And then do I have a different practice to come back to that I can repeat, which we're going to try on in a moment, a basic centering practice. And then often if a practice has been deeply embodied, we have to then do that third piece of somatic opening, which is doing some uprooting of that habit in our thinking and also our muscle memory, and then taking care of it through a different way or through a different practice. So I don't know if this is going to be good news or bad news to you all, but patterns in the body are deeply connected to experiences in our lifetimes, some of which have emotional content. And sometimes as we change our practices, the history, right, that built that pattern into us also emerges and sometimes needs to be worked with. And that could be loss, right? All of us experience loss. It can be a number of things, but developmentally or through our adult lives, impactful experiences tend to influence what our embodied strategies are, right, and how we navigate that. So I hope that speaks to a couple of your questions that you packed in there. Anything you want to say in response?
No, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Here's some of the questions we have. Yeah, we've been talking about this, but just so you know that this is kind of implicit in the backdrop of any of this work, is how are we shaped by these various sites? What are the kind of strategies? What did we learn through these? How do we embody and perpetuate them, even when we might not agree with them? Yeah, this is one of the contradictions of those of us who do systems change, is individually or in how we're living our lives or sometimes in our teams. Our default habits or way of organizing ourselves do not reflect actually the change that we're working on, and we have to work with that gap. And then, you know, what does each side have us practice or embody? Okay. All right, I want to actually get us, I'm going out of order here. So I want to get us into practice. And what we understand through neuroscience and what we understand through somatics is we can't not practice, right? There's my double negative, but we can't not practice. We're always practicing something. Is what we're practicing aligned with our vision and our values is what we want to keep asking ourselves. And then again, most of our practices are inherited. So many of our practices are unconscious, and we want to get them conscious. And then we want to bring in practices that help us be more present and aligned with where we're going. So I'm gonna introduce a practice, and I don't know if this is a very kind of UNDP culture, so I'm gonna maybe ask you to stretch for a moment here too, but I'm gonna ask you all to stand up. If you can, stand up where you are. And we're gonna do two practices together that are purposeful practices. Okay. So I can't really get my whole body in here, but you're gonna see a bunch of me. And this practice can be done sitting down, but we've been sitting so much, that's why I invited you to stand. And also we tend to be able to feel more of ourselves when we're standing. So the first thing I'm gonna ask you to do is line yourself up a little bit. So get your feet under your hips and hands at your sides. And then I'm gonna ask you to bring your attention into your feeling self. So we spend a lot of time in our thinking self. I'm gonna ask you to come into your feeling and your sensing. And one way you can do that is you can really feel for temperatures. Where are you feeling warmer? Where are you feeling cooler? Usually we have a variety of temperatures happening throughout ourselves, throughout our bodies. I'm going to ask you to notice where you feel more tense and where you feel more relaxed. So it might be that your belly's relaxed, but your shoulders are tense. Or your feet are relaxed, but your glutes are more tense. Just notice that range in yourself. And then also notice any movement. So it might be you notice your heart beating. It might be that you notice your breath. Or maybe there's tingling or streaming or pulsing. Yeah, but just start to train your attention to this, what we call somatic attention, right? We can feel ourselves and not just think ourselves. And I'm going to introduce first a basic centering practice. And this is really a practice that's helping us embody or helping us kind of build the muscle of being present, open, connected, and on purpose. And we really think of this as a baseline practice that if you're thrown off, you can always come back to center. Or if you kind of get triggered into one of these automatic responses, we can come back to center. It gives us a place to come back to and a place to practice working and relating from. So let's all drop our attention to center. That's a couple inches below your belly button. If you want to put a hand there, you can. And when we're standing, this is our center of gravity. And many, many traditions have a practice of this center, right? In English, we're just going to call it our center. It's called Hara. It's called many different things in different traditions. But bring your attention to center. And see if you can also bring yourself there. You can let your hand go, but keep your attention dropped here. And from center, we're going to center in 4 directions. The first one is length. So from center in your full length, there's this vertical line. So drop your attention into your lower body. You can drop your weight more into gravity. And at the same time, create more space between your vertebrae. So you're coming into your full length, both settling and lengthening. And see if you can do that again through feeling that rather than it being a concept. That you're feeling yourself, your tissues, and then balancing yourself in length, top and bottom. Inside of length, we also think of this as centering inside of dignity. So we have this place of self-organized dignity to come back to. All right, that's length. So now what we want to do, second direction, is width. And so from that center line, go ahead and center in width. So that is finding a good balance, left or right. You can move back and forth if you want to, find a good balance. And then go ahead and widen out. So widening out across the collarbones, your sides, your ribs, your hips. Let yourself widen. Often under pressure will shrink, or under pressure will kind of puff up and out. And this lets us get in ourselves, connected to ourselves, and widen out. Yeah, so feeling that, widening. And we really look at width as a relational space where we can let ourselves out, we can let others in. There's a developmental stage when we move from crawling to walking. Any of you who have kids, you know this phase where kids will pick things up, hand them to you, and then want it back. Hand it to you and want it back, right? That's us really coming up into the social space developmentally. So length, centering in width, and then let's center front to back in depth. So let your attention first come to your back side. So many of our sensing organs are in the front. So backside, you might feel the back of your head, the back of your heart, the back of your legs, your hamstrings. You might feel your clothes on your back. But notice your backside. And then come all the way through your insides, your internal landscape to the front. So you're feeling both the front and back of your chest, the front and back of your head, right? Feeling this depth in our bodies, that dimension. And then you want to notice, and you can even try this on, rock into your heels some, or like you're pulling back. And then rock more onto the floor, like you're pushing forward. And then find that balance between the two. So you're not pushing forward, you're not pulling back. Just centered inside of depth. So again, from this drop center, we're centered in length and dignity. We're centered in width, right? Available for connection. And then we're centered in depth. Okay? The last thing that we center on, and we develop this inside the work, is we center on who and what matters to us. Or we center on what we call a declaration, which is an intention or a commitment toward a certain future. But just for now, go ahead and center on purpose. If you have a strong sense of your purpose, you can center on that, or center on who and what matters to you. And then really let that care or that purpose fill out into the rest of your nervous system. Yeah, so we're present and we're on purpose. We're present, open, and connected, and on purpose. That's what we're practicing inside of centering. And of course, we want to practice this 300 times. We want to practice this 3,000 times. So that we have this as a place to come back to, a place to orient from, yeah, as a baseline practice. Okay? All right, I'm going to build on this for a moment, and then we'll sit back down again. But I want to have us take centering into movement, or centering into action. And how I'm going to invite us to do that is place left foot in front of the right foot. And the first thing I'm going to have us do is just shift your weight forward onto your front foot and then back. And initiate that movement from center. Often we learn to initiate movement from our heads or even from our shoulders, but initiate that movement from center. If it helps to touch your center, you can. But just go ahead, rock back and forth. Okay, good. And in a moment, now what we're going to do is imagine we're on a very big boat together, and we're going to grab an oar. And we're going to take that oar and we're going to go row. From center, back to center. What's great on a team and not Zoom times when we're together, this is one of the practices that we do in a team to really build alignment with each other. Good, so rowing, staying centered in length, width, and depth. And this is centering, right, in action. We want to get that into our nervous systems as well. And now I'm going to add one more layer, which I'm going to add change, right? Because that tends to be when we get thrown off, is amidst transition and change. So when I say change, bring your back leg forward and your front leg back while we continue to row. It'll look like this. I'll say, and change, and then I'll switch feet. And change, and my back leg goes forward with my front, with my hands. Great. Good. So rowing and change. Good. Continue rowing and change. And change. Continuing to recenter, settle in the change. And change every time. Good, good. And hold. I appreciate how game you all are. Just take a minute and bring your awareness back to the soma, right? Feel your senses, feel movement, feel a change in breath. And with that, go ahead and recenter. Yeah? Center and organize yourself in length. Center and organize yourself in width. Organize and center yourself in depth. And then always coming back to, what do I care about, right? What are we committed to? So we're centering on purpose. All right, let's come back and sit. Thanks for being game and getting up and practicing. We learn new skills that we can use under pressure through embodied practice over time. And these baselines that I just showed you of like, how do I center? How do I recenter myself? Or how do I start to take center into action? Other things that we really work with are things like, how do I make promises? Instead of having an automatic yes or an automatic no, how do I have a centered no? Make centered agreements, have a centered yes. We'll work on skills that are really about how does a team navigate and negotiate together. Yeah, but putting a physical practice to this helps us train our neurobiology right? And helps us literally embody new practices. So if we have time and if y'all are game, we'll do one more, but I wanted to give ourselves a little bit of time to chat a bit more. Any kind of questions or comments? Often this stage of learning, people are like, this is weird. Why am I getting up and doing practices with people? But comments, questions?
Staci, maybe you could just say something a little bit more about like how we come to have an embodied yes or an embodied no, and how that kind of can get shaped inside of us.
We can definitely do that, and we can practice also. Anybody else questions? Let me ask you this. What I notice in our work with people over time is that often initially it can be hard for people to really shift from their thinking to sensing and feeling. And often people at first can go, I can't really feel myself so much. Did any of you have that experience? Some head nods. Yeah. For many of us, our training and our practices during work, like sitting and talking all the time or being on a computer, or our educational training of sitting at desks, often we didn't have a very holistic training. So our default often is, I'm going to kind of numb what's going on so I can sustain what I'm doing and really prioritize thinking. Yeah, so often that's a normal response, that folks are like, I can't feel much, and then we have to thaw back out to learning that somatic awareness over time. Yeah. All right. Let me share this again. So embodied practices at different levels, and this, Lisa, will lead to your question. So what you can notice about your default practices, and then we'll talk about purposeful practice, is there'll be patterns of mood. Like in general, do you tend to be more hopeful, upbeat, cranky, down, right? We'll tend to have patterns of mood or emotional states that we develop. Patterns of breath, how deeply, how shallowly we breathe, reactivity, which we've talked about, and then default actions and default ways of thinking. Those are all part of the mind body, and we develop patterns in every aspect. We'll have shared institutional and cultural practices, which we've been talking about throughout this morning. Really how people interpret leadership, right? Is it singular leadership? Is it collective leadership? Is it a more democratic process of decision-making or a hierarchical process of decision-making? We would consider all of those as really learned practices that are then sustained and supported through certain policies or organizational structures, right? And of course, if we go wider, through how the economy works, right, and social norms work. There's practices in how we pray, right? Not everybody prays, but lots of people pray. How we think about time, which is trippy. We could talk about that for a long time. How we connect, right? How we start business relationships. All of these are embodied practices and ways of being. Some of them, again, serve what we're up to, and some of them actually get in the way of the change we're trying to create. And then I also just wanted to put on here, we learn, again, through our broader systems, and then embody ways of relating with particular groups of people and also with the planet. So not everywhere, but I'm going to say in the broader West, and it's also exported through our economies, our global economy, that we really learn to relate to the earth in an objectifying way. And I think many of our national and international policies obviously reflect this. But earth as a resource, right, for humans. And of course, we've hit the end of the usefulness of that, and we're in a lot of consequence because of that. But really learning an objectified relationship to the earth, and then to others who are systematically or systemically oppressed. So groups who are considered other, right, that actually gets embodied. It's not just like an idea. There's actually a very interesting new piece of research looking at the physiological responses when we are either in the group that is targeted and oppressed, or when we're interacting with a group that is, and the physiological responses are fairly unique that happen. So it's really beyond belief system, like a concept, and really we embody these things, which also make them complicated to change. And then just like we started to do, there's purposeful practices that we can take on. And you can do this again at the individual, organizational, community level. And we see examples of this within various social movements over time. So Gandhian nonviolence, right? It's a philosophy, but it's also a broad base of practices. And it's a practice particularly built for how to be under pressure, yeah? Many of you, I'm sure, know, obviously, the history of those mass movements and mass actions in India, and coming out from under British colonial rule, and then how much that has spread globally. Many social movements today continue to use nonviolent forms that are informed by Gandhi. Nation of Islam, I don't know how familiar people are with the Nation of Islam, but it's very interesting as a part, not only are there religious practices, but there are martial arts dojos. It's split, it's gender split, but there's literally training and practice that happens within the Nation of Islam around martial arts, about how to be, behave, and show up in the face of state violence or police violence. It's very conscious that there are practices and collective practices, both within the religious context and outside the religious context. Black Organizing for Leadership and Dignity is another organization that I wanted to share. We've partnered with them for the last decade. Part of their purpose in the US, obviously we work, generative somatics primarily works in the US context. But one of their purposes is to rebuild the infrastructure of the Black left in the United States, which was pretty systematically taken down in the mid 70s through COINTELPRO and other things that you all are probably familiar with. But they do local and national trainings with Black leaders who are in social movement, and shared practice as part of what they take on. So as people shift organizations, or as people partner in alliance, they already have shared practices around just what we did: centering, rowing, consent practices, practices about building up each other's power rather than over critiquing, which is a big part of the culture of the left in the United States. So what's amazing is kind of wherever people meet or whatever coalitions are getting started, hundreds of people, thousands of people have been through these programs now and can arrive in a space with a shared practice and a shared set of distinctions. And then I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the practices, particularly that we do, come out of Eastern martial arts. So Aikido, which is a non-combative martial art. There's Tai Chi practices, there's Qigong practices, and obviously meditation is very much sourced out of China, Japan, India. Those practices inform a lot of the practices in this particular lineage of somatics, but really any body-based practices that we can then add a purpose to is what we're really looking for. So inside a purposeful practice, these are the components that are needed to make it more than gym class. Yeah, is inside of a purposeful practice, there's exactly that. What is the purpose? What are we practicing? What are we trying to build into our neurobiology? So with the centering practice we just did, we're looking at getting present, open, connected, and on purpose. And it's a baseline way of bringing ourselves back to being present and shifting out of more activated or pressured states. The practices need to be mind-body. There's a great quote in a fiction book that I'm reading the other day when one character was saying you need to pray, and that doesn't mean lay in bed and think about it. Praying is a different practice. So thinking about a practice and doing a practice are different things. So doing a mind-body practice where we're feeling and training from the sensation, the tissues, the nervous system, and the thinking mind at the same time. That a purposeful practice is repeated, the 300 reps, the 3,000 reps. Often our practices have a guide or mentor because it's actually hard for us to see our own default embodiment, but others see it. Often our colleagues or our partners, if we say, hey, what do I do by default? What do I do automatically? They'll have the list for you because we tend to know it in each other, but it's hard for us to see inside of ourselves because that's just what we do, right? And who we be. And then purposeful practice will really show as change in our way of being and in our actions, particularly under pressure, right? So it is the change that can come live and we can actually do something different or relate differently rather than know it, but it doesn't actually show up as change that's noticeable by others, okay? Just given our time here, I want to leave some time for questions and comments, and then we can end with one more practice. So anything, Lisa, that I've missed in the chat, or anybody who wants to bring a question forward? Scott, was it you? Was it you, Scott, who talked about somatics being a term that was used earlier? Was that you?
It was, yeah. My understanding of somatics is that I guess it was first codified in any way, sort of 2,500 years ago, the initial practices of the yogis, and then I guess it then sort of transmuted into different forms and came out of the sort of physical culture practices of the late 19th century into the Pilates was an early form of somatics in the 1920s and sort of codifying it. But then the cyberneticists through the Macy conference in the 1950s and 60s were really looking at somatic change and, the interplay with genoptic change. And then the 1970s sort of built on all of that, as opposed to it sort of starting in the 1970s. That was my question. It sort of sparked to me, and I typed it out because that's kind of what I do, I guess, when something sparks my attention. So yeah, that was me. Just wondering.
I appreciate your knowledge of history. It seems like you read a lot. A little bit, I can tell. Yes to all of what you said. So the term was really, why I said coined, is it started to be used and started to be kind of defined as a field. And coalesce as a field in the 70s. But somatic, holistic practice has been with humans since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
It's what we do. Like dance, song, and drumming are core practices, and they've been cultural practices across every culture, right? And then purposeful practice and designing purposeful practice, like how do we cultivate ourselves, has a long lineage inside of obviously the yogic traditions. It has a long lineage inside the meditation traditions. It has a long lineage inside of martial arts, right? Cross-culturally inside of dance. Like dance wasn't just like, let's boogie, right? Dance in human history is ceremonial, right? It's actually cultivating who we are as human beings and actually how we're coordinating. I mean, it could be part of the prep for literally a hunt, right? So this idea of like there's purposeful collective practice that prepares us and cultivates us individually and collectively towards something that's meaningful for us is definitely as old as humans. And I think in more, let's say disembodied cultures, which I think many Western cultures have become more disembodied over time, there's a bit of a reintroduction of purposeful practice with a bunch of now neuroscience thrown in about why it works. Yeah. What do you want to add, Scott?
Yeah, no, I mean, as you're talking about dance, I was thinking about, I was born in the place which is currently called Australia. But, for 60,000 years, the communication of all manner of things, how to hunt and annihilate all of the large mammals on the continent, how to deal with fire, how to deal with flood, was all through dance. And I don't know, it's just a contention of mine, which I'm interested to hear your perspective, maybe, that the application of Newtonian physics to biological realities and then the sort of concretization of the competition narrative through the primacy of the interpretation of Darwin's work as survival of the fittest being a disembodiment between mind and body and the ability to be able to outcompete through the use of your mind. And then that flowing through into exactly what you were talking about, the objectification and the elimination of the interrelationality between all of us. I am you, you are me, I am the tree, I've been here for 14 billion years, I'll be here forever. I just happen to be in this form at the moment. That the annihilation of that has not been an accidental stage of human development, that it's actually been a deliberate and now greatly amplified and accelerated through the personalization of that fragmentation with social media. That I think what you're doing is unbelievably important. I don't think there's probably anything more important than the bringing together of the understanding that we are 10 trillion entities. I'm not me, I'm a pluralistic structure that contains a whole bunch of different living organisms, all of which are guiding everything that I'm doing every single moment of this sort of entropic existence that I live.
Thank you. Well, I could tell we could probably have a 5-hour conversation because I kind of geek out on it like you are. Yes, to all of that. And to me, the thing about somatic practice, and this again is whatever practice you choose, what's happened often in the West is practices like yoga or practices like mindfulness continue to get atomized and the purpose gets taken out of the center of them. So, I mean, there's like 3 million mindfulness apps now, but it's really like, wait, what are we actually cultivating through the practice of meditation, or what are we cultivating through yoga that is about our individual and collective well-being, right? A lot of these practices in the West, it's almost like the dynamics of racial capitalism capitalism is such a strong shaping force. It's kind of taking over practices that are actually practices that are about helping us de-objectify.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we're in a very complicated time, as you all know, given the work that you do. But the piece, that I find very important, and hopefully this isn't too theoretical, is in coming back into the aliveness of our own somas, our own mind bodies, our capacity to feel, sense, and empathize increases. I have found through working with a lot of different people that there's almost this remembering that happens that we are organisms connected to other organisms, because that knowledge is already, there's a conceptual knowledge of that, and then there's the felt lived knowledge of that. And And then it is also some of the very bad habits, let's say, that we've learned through objectification or through capitalism or through disconnection from the earth and planet. Those live in us too. We perpetuate those habits and patterns, but somatics is a very practical way to break those up and then learn new ways of being, right? Interdependence is all a nice idea. How do we be, live, and relate from interdependence? There's very little in our structures that help us do that, right? So we're kind of at counter practice with many of our current economic and social structures. But given what we care about, sustaining the planet, not killing off all large mammals and insects, right? Like having a sustainable, life-affirming future, I think requires us individually and collectively to take on new practices and change. And then of course, change the broader structures. I want to share actually one more slide with you because it's one of my favorite questions. And maybe you all will relate to it. We've gone utterly out of order, so I'll just pop ahead until I find it. Here we go. Nope. Oh, that's too bad. Well, now I can't find it, so I just wasted 30 seconds there. But one of the questions I live in is what governing structures, what economies, what social norms do we need to create to have millions of people get to embody interdependence, cooperation, and a sustainable relationship with the planet? Yeah, those big systems shape millions of people and have millions of people embody things like competition or disconnection or separation. So as systems people, right, what are those? And I know this is part of your work, but what are those economies? What are those social norms, right? What are the organizational structures that allow millions of people to be basically practicing cooperation, interdependence, right, and that sustainable relationship with the planet. All right, we are at time. I appreciate spending this time with you. Happy to, well, keep engaging. Yeah, so thank you for the conversation. I know it's a little odd to practice over Zoom, but I appreciate that you're game for that.
Thank you, Staci, so much for giving us 2 hours of your time and extensive knowledge and experience with somatics. Just to say for folks, if anybody's interested in discovering more about the work that the Strozzi Institute does, you can either get in touch through me and I will connect you up with Staci and the team in the office. So just email me and we can send you further information or connect you with the right people. Yeah, here's to more purposeful practice.
Have good days, everybody. Nice to see you. Nice to meet you.
Bye, everyone.